Genius stuck in the mud. Picture the smartest man in Europe, stuck up to his waist in a filthy swamp, unable to move, unable to escape, and the only people who can save him refuse to lift a finger. Not because they hate him, because they want to humiliate him first. This is not fiction. This really happened to a man named David Hume, a man Albert Einstein credited with sparking the theory of relativity, a man who woke Immanuel Kant from what Kant himself called his dogmatic slumber, a man who personally mentored Adam Smith, the father of modern economics. And yet this same towering mind spent years broke, rejected, humiliated, and hunted by his own church. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the world almost lost him and how he clawed his way from total obscurity to becoming one of the most important thinkers who ever lived. Stay to the end, because the final twist in his story involves a bitter feud with another famous philosopher, and it is far stranger than you expect. And along the way, you will see exactly why some of the smartest people in history are also treated as the most dangerous, born into a life he was never supposed to want. David Hume was born in the spring of 1711 in Edinburgh, Scotland. His family was respectable and comfortable. His father was a lawyer. His mother came from a well-known legal family. On paper, this baby had one job: grow up, put on a lawyer robe, inherit the family business, become wealthy and respected and forgettable. But life had other plans. When David was barely 2 years old, his father died suddenly. His mother refused to remarry. Instead, she raised 3 children completely on her own. Young David grew up quietly in the countryside, far from the noise of the city. And very early on, the adults around him noticed something unusual. This was not an ordinary child. He was reading and reasoning at a level that stunned people twice his age. So at the age of 11, while other children were still playing in the street, David was sent to Edinburgh University. Sitting in lecture halls next to students years older than him, carrying the weight of enormous expectations on shoulders that had barely grown. Most children that age are learning to tie their shoes. David was already learning to dismantle the biggest ideas in Western thought. Keep this in mind, because this same restless mind is about to make a decision that will nearly destroy his own future before it even begins. The perfect student who was secretly rebelling. Everyone assumed the plan was working. The family expected David to study law and become a respected attorney. And on the surface, that is exactly what seemed to be happening. He sat at his desk for hours, with heavy books in front of him. His family walked past and smiled with pride, thinking their son was buried in legal textbooks. What they did not know is that David despised the law. He found it dry, lifeless, and suffocating. So he did something clever. He kept the boring law books open on top as a disguise. But underneath, he was secretly devouring the works of ancient philosophers and poets. He soaked up ideas about human nature, morality, and truth like a sponge that could never get full. He grew so confident in his own thinking that he once wrote to a friend that you could learn nothing from professors that was not already written better in books. That is not humility. That is a young mind already convinced it was built for something bigger than a courtroom. But conviction alone does not pay the bills. And what happens next will force David to choose between the safe life his family expected and a future nobody could guarantee. The moment he burned the safe path. Somewhere around the age of 18, something shifted permanently inside David. He experienced what he later called a new discovery in his own thinking. He never explained the details, but the impact was undeniable. From that point forward, he made a decision that terrified his family. He would abandon every ordinary ambition. No law career, no comfortable inheritance path, no safe, respectable life. He would give everything to philosophy. But there was a problem. Philosophy did not pay rent. His family was not wealthy enough to support a son who simply wanted to sit around and think for a living. So in 1734, he tried something practical. He took a job as a merchant clerk in the trading city of Bristol. And in that same year, he made a symbolic decision. He changed the spelling of his own last name, partly because the English kept mispronouncing it, but also because he was quietly reinventing himself, leaving one identity behind and stepping toward another. He had no publisher, no professorship, no guaranteed income, just a stubborn belief that he had something the world needed to hear. That belief was about to be tested harder than he could imagine, running away to France with nothing but an idea. The merchant job lasted only a few miserable months before David walked away from it for good. He now had one goal: write the book that would change how humanity understood itself. But he needed somewhere cheap and quiet to do it. So at 23 years old, he crossed the sea to France. He spent a short time exploring Paris, then deliberately left the city behind. He settled in a quiet French town called La Flèche, a town that happened to be home to the old school of the philosopher René Descartes. There, David built himself a brutally strict lifestyle, almost no luxuries, almost no social life. Every ounce of his time and money poured into one single mission: build the philosophical system that would explain the human mind from the ground up. This was not comfortable genius at work. This was obsession. A young man alone in a foreign country, betting his entire future on a stack of blank paper. What he was about to write down would eventually be studied in nearly every philosophy classroom on Earth. But first, it nearly cost him his mind. The book that nearly destroyed his own mind. What David was building in that quiet French town became a work called A Treatise of Human Nature. And writing it was brutal. He turned his sharpest doubts on everything humans take for granted. Why do we trust that the sun will rise tomorrow? Why do we believe one event causes another? Can reason alone ever prove that God exists? He pushed his logic further and further until the ground beneath his own thinking started to crumble. If pure reason could not even guarantee the sunrise, then what could it guarantee about anything? He pushed himself so hard into radical doubt that he nearly broke down completely. He later admitted he came dangerously close to what we would now call a full mental collapse. And here is the twist nobody expects. What saved him was not a clever counter-argument. It was dinner with friends, a game of backgammon, a walk outside. Ordinary human pleasure pulled him back from the edge of his own logic every single time. Then he would return to his desk, and the arguments that once terrified him suddenly looked less crushing. Think about that for a second. One of the sharpest logicians in history was rescued from his own mind, not by more logic, but by a plate of food and a few laughs with friends. Even genius needs a break from itself. And soon, that hard-won manuscript would finally be ready to face the world. The masterpiece that landed in complete silence. In early 1739, 27-year-old David finally published the first parts of his treatise. He had sacrificed years of his youth, his social life, and nearly his sanity for this moment. He expected controversy. He expected praise. He expected something. What he got was silence. Not outrage, not debate, just nothing. Even the religious critics who loved attacking bold new ideas did not bother responding. The work he had poured his entire life into landed like it had never been written at all. Most people would have quit forever at this point, packed away their ambitions, and gone home defeated. Imagine giving away years of your youth, your health, and your social life for a single project, only to watch it disappear without a whisper. Most people would have quietly given up and walked back toward the safe, boring life their family always wanted for them. But David Hume did something almost nobody in his position could do. The comeback strategy that changed everything. David later admitted that he was naturally an optimist by temperament, and it saved him. Instead of giving up, he studied his own failure like a scientist. He realized the problem was not his ideas. The problem was how he delivered them. His writing was too dense, too formal, too locked inside academic language that ordinary readers could not enter. So he made a bold decision. He would stop writing like a professor and start writing like a sharp, witty essayist that regular people actually wanted to read. He rebuilt his approach completely and gave himself a new identity. He called himself an ambassador, carrying deep ideas out of the ivory tower and into everyday conversation. He picked topics people already cared about: politics, society, human behavior, and he wrote about them with clarity and bite. No more locked doors and dusty jargon, just sharp, confident writing that pulled ordinary readers straight into ideas they never thought they could understand. This single decision would completely rewrite the direction of his career, from invisible to influential. This new approach worked almost immediately. His collections of essays on morals and politics found a real audience for the first time in his life. Readers who had ignored his heavy philosophical treatise were suddenly quoting his sharp essays in coffee houses and salons. David Hume, the invisible failed author, was becoming David Hume, the writer people actually wanted to read. This should have been the moment everything got easier. Instead, it opened the door to the most dangerous chapter of his career. Because once the world starts paying attention to a brilliant mind, it also starts asking uncomfortable questions about what that mind actually believes. The job he deserved and never got. With his growing reputation, David set his sights on a university professorship, specifically a position at the prestigious University of Edinburgh. By every measure of talent, he was more than qualified. He even had the support of a respected mentor named Francis Hutcheson, a well-known moral philosophy professor. David assumed this application was close to guaranteed. Then reality hit hard. The university board rejected him, and the person who helped lead that rejection was the very same mentor who had once supported him. Why would his own allies turn against him? Because they went back and reread his earlier philosophical writing, and they were terrified. His work questioned miracles, questioned traditional proof of God, and questioned religious certainty itself. In an era where universities were required to protect strict Christian teaching, his own brilliance made David look dangerous. The job went instead to a far less talented but far less controversial candidate. Being brighter than everyone in the room did not protect David. In some ways, it made him a bigger target, and the pressure was only beginning to build. The second rejection and the witch hunt that followed. A few years later, a second opportunity opened at the University of Glasgow. David applied again, hoping this time would be different. It was not. Facing pressure from religious leaders, the university rejected him again. Around this same period, extreme factions inside the Scottish Church began actively campaigning to have him formally expelled and condemned. This was not an exaggeration or a joke. In the decades before David was even born, a young student had been executed simply for expressing doubts about Christianity in public. David understood the real danger he was living inside. He often hid his boldest arguments behind anonymous publishing or fictional characters in dialogue, just to protect himself. It took the loyalty of moderate friends inside the church to keep him from being formally cast out, twice rejected by universities, actively hunted by religious extremists. The most brilliant mind in Britain could not get hired to teach. Stop and sit with that for a moment. Being right too early and too openly nearly cost this man his entire livelihood and possibly his safety. So how does a man in that position even survive? Babysitting. A madman to pay the bills. With academic doors slammed shut, David still had to eat. So in 1745, he accepted one of the strangest jobs imaginable. He became the private tutor and companion to a nobleman named the Marquis of Annandale, a man who had been officially declared mentally unstable. Think about that picture for a moment. One of the greatest philosophical minds in European history, spending his days managing the emotional outbursts of a man the government itself considered unfit to function. The job was exhausting and emotionally draining, and it lasted barely a year before it fell apart. But something important happened during that strange, miserable chapter. It was there that David quietly began drafting what would eventually become his most profitable work, a sweeping history of England. Nobody around him could have guessed that the lowest, most humiliating job of his life was secretly planting the seed of his greatest success. From philosopher to secretary of a general. After escaping the tutoring nightmare, David took on an entirely different kind of work. He became secretary to a military commander, General St. Clair. This job sent him traveling across Europe on official business, including trips to Vienna and Turin. The quiet thinker, who once secluded himself in a small French town, was now crossing borders as part of a working diplomatic mission. This experience gave him something books never could: direct exposure to different governments, different cultures, and the raw mechanics of real-world politics. He was no longer just a man who theorized about how societies work from behind a desk. He was watching diplomacy and power unfold in real time in foreign capitals. For a philosopher who believed all human knowledge comes from lived experience, this was priceless first-hand research. And somehow in the middle of this demanding travel schedule, he still found time to write another major work, Exploring Human Understanding. Once again, the reception was underwhelming, but David kept building anyway. Rejection after rejection after rejection. Yet somehow, he never once stopped writing. That kind of stubbornness is exactly what was about to pay off, in a way nobody around him expected. The quiet job that set up his final rise. Eventually, David returned home to Edinburgh. After years of rejection from universities, the legal profession offered him an unexpected opportunity. He was appointed librarian at the Advocates' Library. On the surface, this looked like a minor administrative role. Underneath it was exactly the resource he needed: shelves and shelves of historical documents sitting right at his fingertips every single day. Access to an enormous collection of historical material that let him complete the ambitious history project he had started years earlier, during his strangest, most humiliating job. The very same episode that once felt like rock bottom quietly became the foundation for the achievement that would finally make him famous across all of Europe. A rejected philosopher, a mocked outsider, a man who once had to beg for his freedom in a swamp, was about to become one of the most celebrated writers in the English-speaking world. Every rejection, every insult, every year of silence had somehow become fuel instead of an ending. Think about how many people quit long before they reached their own version of this quiet library job. David kept going through humiliation that would have broken most careers permanently. And that persistence was about to deliver a payoff far bigger than a professorship ever could. His history of England would eventually make him wealthier and more famous across Europe than any university chair ever would have. The same churches and universities that once slammed their doors on him would one day be forced to reckon with his ideas anyway. That transformation, including his complicated, bitter falling out with fellow philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, is a story so wild it deserves its own telling. A story of paranoia, broken friendship, and one of the strangest philosophical rivalries in history. Make sure you come back for that one.